We are now going to have our second session of the day, the U.S. India Technology Corridor and India's G20 leadership. Our panel curator and moderator is Marsha Vande, an independent director and advisor. She has served as an independent director of Tata Capital Singapore and Quantum Advisors, which is based in Mumbai. And she's doing a deep, deep study on India right now, and we are benefiting from all of her connections and learnings. So please welcome Marsha Vande.
So thank you very much, Margaret. I have to say, I've had the good fortune to be affiliated with Rafiq for well over 20 years. And each time I listen to him, I'm even more impressed, I have to say. And, but the best, Rafiq, is the relationship being chocolate with chili pepper. I mean, that's not going to go away. So, well, thank you all, and it's really a privilege to be here with you and to talk about really one of my really favorite subjects. I have been for years engrossed in the U.S.-China story, and more recently, the U.S.-India story. As an independent intellectual entrepreneur is what I was described earlier today. But I do some advisory work and also board corporate work. The panel that we've assembled is really a very impressive panel, and we wanted to talk really about the lens, wanted to talk about India and the economic progress and the momentum that Margaret mentioned in her remarks, having just come from India. But before, I wanted to make just a brief comment about India in the G20, a topic I've been focusing on a good bit. And then we'll go directly to the panel. I'll introduce them from here. Each one will speak for a few minutes, and then we'll take questions as well. And I'll have a few questions for them myself. But just briefly on India and its economic outlook as we are preparing to take in the headlines around the G20 that are sure to run fast and furious. This meeting here, celebrating the legacy of Naren Gupta, couldn't be timelier in any way, shape, or form. I mean, the Prime Minister Modi is due in Washington next week for a state visit. Rafiq referenced that. I think Margaret also did in her remarks. And he'll meet with President Biden, and then he'll address the joint meeting of the U.S. Congress, after which he'll return to Delhi, and then there his deputies have been scurrying really to prepare for the gathering of world leaders in September in Delhi, so the G20. And I have to say, expectations are very high for the G20 meetings, particularly when it's about showcasing India. For starters, the cast of summit leaders who will be assembled represents something like 85% of the world's GDP. They also represent a majority of the so-called global South's emerging or developing economies, which individually have limited clout on the global stage, but as a bloc have potential to leverage their interests in the face of big geopolitical outcomes. Holding the G20 gavel will be a unique opportunity for Mr. Modi, facing an election year in 2024 as he does, to showcase the strides India has made really since the 1990 reforms, but in particular since 2014 when he first became Prime Minister. His intention is sure to spotlight the successes he hopes are positioning India's nearly $4 trillion economy and the world's largest population for sustainable, rapid-fire economic growth. The stage will also be his to command. His agenda is ambitious. In keeping with the theme for the summit, One Earth, One Family, One Future, his objectives are obvious extensions of his political leadership style and goals, as well as his intention that India play a significant role regionally and internationally. He'll push inclusivity across the G20's key thematics on India's behalf, but also that of the global South. His spotlight also will be on India's new mantle, so to speak, in climate leadership. In 2021, at COP26 at Glasgow, Mr. Modi, in a remarkable statement, pledged to turn India into a green energy powerhouse, and he backed that pledge with a commitment plus targets to be met no sooner than 7 years from now to achieve net zero emissions by 2070. A year later, in 2022, the International Energy Agency described the scale of India's climate transformation as nothing short than stunning. India still is the world's third largest emitter of greenhouse gases and continues to generate 51% of its electricity from coal. But Mr. Modi's intentions have put the country on track to change that reputation. Just for starters, India is becoming a global leader in renewable energy and the manufacture of electric vehicles, with its technology sector playing an integral role. And according to NASSCOM, India's $227 billion technology sector stands to nearly double to $500 billion by 2030, with clean tech a part of that advance across the economy. So with those brief remarks on G20 and where India is hoping to make its mark, it brings me to our panel, who are already here, assembled here to my right. And they're very impressive, really. I have to say, we could have a one-on-one with each one individually without any trouble. In fact, we could spend the afternoon with each one individually, from my perspective. We'll go a little wide of our headline, and I've asked each to offer thoughts on the momentum of India's economy through their respective lens on the private sector, investment and commercial enterprise, and the private sector partnership with government, where basically government enables and the private sector decides whether to execute. Our three panelists bring impressive backgrounds which reflect investment and commercial diplomacy expertise, deep appreciation for the competitive opportunities of India's developing economic narrative, and expertise working with the intricacies of technology while also advancing the role technology plays in the U.S. in India and the India-U.S. corridor. First up will be Arun Kumar, who has made a few comments from the audience so far. He brings an especially unique vantage point. He is currently managing partner with Celesta Capital, a prominent early-stage investor in disruptive technologies and innovative businesses, headquartered in San Francisco and focused on India markets. He headed KPMG India for 5 years, prior to which he served as President Obama's Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Global Markets. At Commerce, he was also Director General of the U.S. and Foreign Commercial Service and a key architect of the U.S. India Strategic and Commercial Dialogue. He is a director of India Spora, plus a poet, which I like particularly, and an author. This fall, HarperCollins will publish his newest book, The Global Trade Paradigm. Arun will focus on the drivers he thinks are contributing to India's ambitious agenda. He will be speaking from a perspective inside the investment and commercial circles where he now engages. Next, we'll hear from Amit Kapoor. Amit is the honorary chair of the Institute for Competitiveness in Delhi. He holds joint appointments at Stanford and Harvard. He has co-authored with his Harvard colleague, business guru Michael Porter, the blueprint for India's competitiveness between now and its centennial. He is a deep and friendly thinker about what makes government and enterprise go. He too is an author with an upcoming book with co-author Amitabh Kant, India's Sherpa at the upcoming G20. Amit will speak about the catalysts he sees driving India's domestic and economic policies. And our third panelist is Harshul Asnani, whose work is directly on point with what we think of as the U.S. India corridor. He is Senior Vice President and Head of the Global Technology Business Vertical at Tech Mahindra. He leads a global team in providing software and communication solutions to today's fast-paced, technology-dependent enterprises. He's been instrumental in growing Tech Mahindra's once nascent footprint in North America into a multi-million-dollar business in a very competitive marketplace. Harshul will speak about the catalysts he sees that relate to technology and its evolution inside India, Silicon Valley, and in the U.S. India corridor. So thank you very much, and we'll start with, at the far right, with Arun, and then just come down, please, and we'll share the mic and then have a few questions after.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marsha. It's great to be here among so many friends, and a particular honor to be here at an event that commemorates Naren, for whom I had tremendous admiration, and I had known for many, many years. Coming to the point that Marsha wanted me to address about the economic situation in India and how investors and business folks should view it. I want to start by saying that the government of Narendra Modi, and I've been following them since 2014, when I was in the US government, they've displayed unprecedented economic dynamism. This is a point I think that everyone across the political spectrum in India will agree with. This progress has many elements. One of the most impressive elements is that in infrastructure, literally the face of India is changing. So if you've been there 5 years ago, you can see that today there's a lot of progress. And if you've been there 10 years ago, it's like night and day. Whether it's airports, ports, highways, and now even the railways. There's also a focus on the underprivileged through provision of resources, direct cash transfers to farmers, toilets, cooking gas cylinders, clean drinking water, electricity access. And all of this is really important because our social safety net is critical. So as a business person, you want to operate in a country where there is a strong social security net. And these are the ways in which this government has addressed that issue. Then the digital economy is a very big story. India is rapidly becoming digital. If you look at the numbers of smartphones, internet users, the volume of digital payments, these are staggering numbers. The Digital India program of the government has expanded digital infrastructure, taking broadband into rural areas. Delivery of services, government services over the internet is becoming ubiquitous. India has created what's called the India Stack, a digital stack, which starts with a uniform, a kind of unique identity for every individual. And that's combined with a payments interface and other capabilities, really transforming how business is performed right from the lowest level where you're buying vegetables to the highest levels. So the digital story of India is a very big story. Next story is a startup culture. This government has put a lot of money, a lot of resources, and a lot of dynamism behind promoting a culture of startups. And I must say, it's not just the central government. A number of state governments have followed suit. And I think one of the stories of India that's not appreciated is that it's not just a story of the central government. You've really got to look at what's happening in the states. The states are, in fact, the engines of growth in India. So many states have taken a lot of initiative in promoting a startup system. If you go to India and you go to the innovation hubs created at, say, the IIT Madras or the IIT Bombay, or at places like Bangalore, around the Indian Institute of Science, around in Hyderabad, these are very, very impressive. And I've been meeting entrepreneurs, teams there that want to start companies, want to create new innovative solutions, and they are just extremely impressive. I mean, you can see the future of India when you go and meet the folks there. So I want to say, when I was in the US government back in early 2014, when the new government in India just came to power, at that point, the relationship between the US and India at the government-to-government level was pretty dismal. I don't know if people remember that time, but people in Washington, frankly, didn't have time for India. But many of us, in the government, saw the new election as an opportunity to change that curve. In our early conversations with the government of India, we talked about things like ease of doing business, the need for an insolvency and bankruptcy code, the need to streamline logistics and have a goods and services tax. All of these things were things that many governments in India had over the years understood the importance of. But what I can say today is that we've seen a lot of action in those areas. On the ease of doing business, index, for example, India has climbed the rankings from the low 150s to, I think, the 40s. The goods and services tax, there were some initial hiccups, but it's been implemented, and therefore trucks move much faster in the country, especially over improved highways. The GST kind of collections are at all-time high. Alongside, there have been other regulations like the Real Estate Regulation and Development Act. So there have been a lot of reforms that have actually occurred. So I'd say, as a result of these reforms, the sentiment for India among multinational corporations, among overseas investors is high. There's been a big focus by the Indian government on attracting foreign direct investment. So these are the kinds of things that I see as very positive. Marsha, do you want me to talk about lessons for other countries as well, or? Yeah, okay. So you had wanted me. So I'd say, what are the lessons for other countries? I'd say the less developed countries. So one definitely is infrastructure. I think infrastructure investment combined with policies that ease logistics is a key. These may seem obvious to economists like my friend Anupam, but India had not realized this for a long time or implemented it. Second, I think digitization is definitely another place where there are a lot of lessons to be learned from India. The third, I would say, is a promotion of FDI, making it clear to investors, foreign investors, and domestic investors that investment is welcome. And fourth, promoting entrepreneurship. The energies that entrepreneurs bring to the economy is really amazing, and we're seeing that in India.
Thank you. So just following up from what Arun had actually said, so, if you really talk about India and the policies that are driving India, there are two distinct pillars which have been driving what India is doing and how they're really looking at the global level as well. One is clearly what you would call as ease of doing business, and Arun did allude to the fact that how India has improved on the rankings and so on and so forth. But I think the most important factor is that how it really matters for people on ground. How do they find it much easier to start enterprises today? How the young are actually looking at creating enterprises per se. Like close to about 100,000 new enterprises are getting created at this point in time within the country each year. So that's a very huge dynamic that you're really looking at. And of course, like you will have failure within enterprises and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, what we are really looking at is a huge leap in the number of unicorns that are actually emerging from India. But what are the kind of unicorns that are emerging? Like they are effectively trying to tackle the institutional voids that actually existed within the country. So what I do see is that how government has enabled the enterprises to create solutions for the challenges that people were facing. So UPI is a great example. Like on that stack, what are the kind of enterprises that have actually got created? So if you talk about Bharat Pay, or if you talk about Paytm and such set of enterprises, they have enabled close to about 90% people to really do transactions on the internet or on your mobile phones. And those transactions are absolutely free of charge. You don't have to pay money for it. So it does create a lot of challenge for enterprises like Visa or the MasterCards of the world, but what they're doing is something substantial. And now India is actually looking at taking it to the global south, wherein they're saying that as to how that India stack or UPI story can actually get replicated across the world. And the government is really talking about it. The second thing, if you really look at it, like one was of course ease of doing business. The second aspect is what you would call as the ease of living. In fact, the Prime Minister has been really talking about the idea of ease of living. In fact, I have had the chance of really creating the ease of living index for the government of India. What you're really saying is that how economic ability is actually rising within different set of states and cities. What are the kind of opportunities that are there? What is sustainability that actually exists within the cities itself? So if you really look at the whole idea of ease of living, there are multiple things that have happened. Like, there is a huge societal change that we are actually seeing right now. 10 years back, how many of us would have actually talked about clean India? How many of us would have actually talked about the idea of Swachh Bharat or toilets? It looks like unique. Like India was about 70% of India was defecating in the open at that point in time. If you really want to believe National Health Family Survey, it says that close to about 80% of the Indian people are not defecating in the open now. Just about 20% is there. So if you really, this is a huge shift that has happened. the whole idea of cleanliness across cities is also emerging. In fact, today if you go to New York, New York is a far smellier place in the world than you actually go to the cities within India. And I'm sure you can actually feel that. New York stinks. I'm sorry for saying that. In fact, I do not know how people live there. In fact, that city should actually die down fairly soon. But then the question here is that the other thing was the whole idea of the Jam Trinity, Jan Dhan Aadhaar Mobile. And when you talk about Aadhaar, the unique identification, that has enabled a lot of people. The whole social transfer that has actually happened within the country is based on that unique identification that has happened. Of course, it's a legacy of the previous government, you might say, but what they have been able to do within the country is absolutely stunning. So today, the leakages on the system are fairly low. In fact, Rajiv Gandhi possibly made a statement that 92% or 92% of the money that goes out actually leaks away. But right now, that is not the thing that is actually happening. The third thing is about education. If you really look at it, this government has talked about education much more clearly than any other government in the past. And when I say education itself, if you really look at a very simple statistic here, for every additional year of schooling that a person does after class 8, increases his ability to earn by about 9,000 rupees per year. Looks like a small number, but then look at the multiplier that you're really talking about. So the more and more people who are going in for higher education, it enables them to actually talk about multipliers which are far stunning, and that is what you're really looking at. In fact, if you really look at the gross enrollment ratios and so on and so forth, that have significantly increased over a period of time. And then, of course, if you really dig deeper in terms of what are the pillars which is driving India's policy today, and I'm just trying to pick up from the competitiveness roadmap that we had actually created for the government of India at the behest of the Prime Minister. So we say that there are 4 S principles that the government follows. If you really want to understand India today, there are those 4 S or the 4 pillars that are actually driving it. And what are those 4 pillars? Like one is, of course, it is about sustained or sustainable. So if you really look at the sustainable thing that you're talking about, you talk about climate change, you talk about other things. The question here is that how do we really resolve for those issues? Those are the challenges that the global south will face far bigger than any other part of the world. If you really look at, say, US might have issues of climate change, but the countries which are going to pay the price for climate change are going to be countries in South Asia. So it is not going to be US which is going to feel the pinch. You will still continue to have water, but it is countries like India, Bangladesh, Pakistan who will have to fight in terms of like how the water actually comes to your thing. So that is this whole sustainable idea. That is where you're looking at renewable energy and so on and so forth. The second thing is about shared prosperity. And the shared prosperity perspective is that how do we actually take the benefits to people across the board? Are we really looking at that model? Today, if you really look at it, the capitalistic model that we are really looking at within the country is far different from what we are actually seeing out here in the US. In fact, I was talking to Zain earlier in the day, and he makes a very remarkable statement in terms of giving. If you really look at these social models or business models that are getting created, they are a thing of replication that is going to happen in Global South. I see that the future of businesses, the future business models are going to emerge from India and not from this part of the world. The scalability is going to happen there, not in this part of the world. Your models out there are going to be hugely different. In fact, if you talk about a company like Zomato, it has a very, very different model in terms of like how they're able to price point in terms of delivering products and vis-a-vis what you actually talk about DoorDash out here or something, which is supremely expensive. So if you really look at these set of ideas, this is something very, very powerful. The third thing that I have to talk about is what you would call as social, and how that movement of changing social ideas is actually taking leap within the country. Rafiq did say that it could be a faltering democracy or whatever. I think there are two sides of the same coin in terms of like how do you really look at things. I might actually be of an opinion that India is possibly becoming more resilient over a period of time because we are talking about things that people are fearful of. US is one of the most fearful democracies. You are not supposed to say so many things. You just have to shut up. In fact, the kind of things that are happening within the US is there is something like political correctness. India is actually going through those stories of like, let's go beyond that political correctness and let's understand what is right. And that is what the debate is all about. So I think it is becoming more resilient than any other place in the world. In fact, right now, I must say that US is possibly a faltering democracy because you elect Donald Trump and not something more reasonable. That's a different story. Please read my book on democracy. So I would just invite you to have a look at that. But the last thing that I would like to say is that it is about resilience, how India is building resilient systems, which is actually driving. COVID is a great example of how resilience actually worked. Today in India, like the number of deaths that have happened in India is far lower. In fact, whatever be the story that you want to actually say, like one is Lancet study which says 4 million people have died in India. The government of India statistic is that about 600,000 people have died in India. Let's assume it is 4 million for the purposes of this interaction itself. That itself is a very low number in terms of the country of a magnitude of India, 145 billion people. And look at the kind of benefits that we actually accrued out of it. The resilience was through giving vaccines to people and how much economic benefit you have been able to accrue through it. But last point here, but if you really look at India per se, the global south is what India wants to look at, like how India can provide solutions to people like Africa. That is where the whole power for how India is actually going to look at exploiting or creating positive benefits across the world. It is a state which is not about territorial ambitions. It is a state which is talking about ambitions for really making people's lives easier and better across the world. India versus China, China is about territorial ambitions. India is all about something else. It's about human endeavor, and that is how I look at it.
No, thanks, Marsha. Between Arun and Amit, I think they decided to steal my thunder a little bit on my prepared remarks. So on the fly, I'll try to build on what they just said, specifically when it comes to technology and its evolution in India. Over the past few years, I think India has really surprised the world at the pace at which it has evolved technologically. And in my view, there are about 5 developments specifically that have led and shaped the evolution of the technology prowess of India. Number 1, I think, is the startup ecosystem. The quantum and the diversity of startups that have emerged in India over the last 7 or 8 years has been nothing short of dramatic. With 20 billion plus capital flowing into India, with more than 100 plus unicorns now in India, with 100,000 plus people working in startups in India, and more than 100 active incubators in India. And I know there are a lot of VCs in the room and here who would probably have better figures than I do, but the numbers are staggering, and in particular in such a short order. So I think this has propelled India into the top 3 startup ecosystems in the world. And it is also said that the valuation that these startups are likely to build in the next 7 to 8 years is more than the valuation that the IT services and the IT consulting world that I belong to has developed in the last 40 years. So point number 2, I think it's the whole digital initiatives for the public services, the government-led initiatives. And as Arun talked about it a little bit, the popularly known as the India Stack, whether it is Aadhaar, which has linked 1.4 billion people, or whether it is the UPI, which has built out the whole digital payment infrastructure in India. I think these are shining examples of what the private sector and the public sector coming together can do and achieve, and something that the whole world can learn from. Not just the 2 big things like UPI and Aadhaar that the world knows of, but there are those other initiatives around urban stack, the health stack, which are also emerging into very, very powerful stacks, so to speak. And that this whole infrastructure that is being created is also leading to a development of a lot of use cases and companies that are kind of getting built at the back of this infrastructure, like I think you spoke about the Bharat Pay, Paytm, and so on and so forth, companies that have emerged out of this stack. Number 3, I think the whole domestic consumption of technology in India. India has become a massive market for consuming technology, whether it's a WhatsApp or an Instagram. India's prowess in ability to consume technology, primarily because of the penetration of internet and the cheap availability of mobile phones, etc., has really led to a massive infiltration of technology in India. And today, large tech companies are getting deeper and deeper into the Indian ecosystem, whether it is Meta, whether it is Apple, or the likes of Cisco and others in the valley. Number three, I would say, number four rather, I would say is the outsourcing and the IT services. When I say this, I mean there are two parts to this. One is the Indian technology services companies, the likes of Tech Mahindra and TCS and others. And also at the other end, the captives, right? The big tech companies, or for that matter, the Fortune 1000 companies worldwide, they've built their captives in India, which are now run into tens of thousands of people. And I think you said the size of the services business is 227 billion today and likely to double in a few years. But the important part is technology, services companies, and outsourcing world has been very resilient, have pivoted 2 or 3 times in the last 2 decades in spite of the economic ups and downs. And today they have emerged from being just those glorified body shops and staffing companies to more value creation companies. Today, companies like Tech Mahindra have a seat at the table when it comes to our customers' digital transformation agendas, for example. Yeah, not many people know we have a 5G lab right here in the valley, which 75% of the carriers in the US kind of cell phones get tested in our lab before they go out into the world. It's an essential service. Clearly goes to show that we have emerged beyond labor arbitrage as a business. Yeah? And lastly, I would say it's the talent pool, right? It's a lot has been said about the demographic dividend that India offers. Median age of 29. I think 2/3 of the population of India is in the working class between the ages of 18 and 65. And this demographic dividend is likely to continue for the next 20 to 30 years. The way I see it, it's a boon and a bane. The opportunity obviously is pretty obvious in terms of amount of. India is probably the only country of its size that's getting younger as compared to most of the companies. So it can potentially provide talent to the world. But at the same time, this is a double-edged sword. If you look at the India Skills Report of 2022, 50% of Indian working force is not employable. Today, the gap between the skills needed in India and what's available is huge. And the pace at which the new skills are required versus the pace at which new skills are being developed, the gap continues to be pretty huge. And while 6.7% kind of whatever growth we are showing in GDP is very impressive, to accommodate so many new people entering the job market, it is estimated that over the next 8 years, that another 90 million people will enter the job market. 60 million of those are going to be from the farm sector who want to come out of the farm sector, and another 30 million will get added. And on top of that, we're expecting 40 to 50 million women workforce entering the job market, right? Which in a way is a very, very good sign. But at the same time, does India have room for such job creation, right? Unless it grows at the scale of 8.1 to 8.2% of GDP, it will continue to be hard for India to give jobs to so many people coming up, and could lead to a lot of socio-economic issues as well. Right, so I'll just stop here and maybe address some questions.
Terrific. Thank you, all three of you, very much. And as I said before, we could have had a one-on-one with each of you. There's so much substance to try to take in and parse. But I would ask a couple of general questions, and it goes to the issues of what's really driving the momentum. Is there a sense that it is in the culture, in the water, that India, given a chance, is now taking the ball and running with it? Or did that depend on the Modi government and his sense of the direction that India could go? And then I would add to that, since we want to go to the audience as soon as we can, what might be the flip side of the picture that you're painting? What might be the obstacles that India still has to deal with? Harshul, you dealt with the workforce, the skill level, but still the miraculous change in terms of the technology sector is very interesting. But I would ask that, is the driver Mr. Modi? Can it continue, say he were to be the election next year were to be upended and he not to be elected? Is he the driver? What's the flip side, too, of what your picture is taking? And we can start with Arun, if you just very briefly.
I think the U.S. India momentum will continue regardless of who is driving it. Certainly, the Prime Minister Modi has brought a lot of dynamism, but I think The countries are very aligned on what they need to accomplish. So certainly, I think it will continue. Any change, obviously, there'll be a bit of a, things can go slow for a while, but overall, I think the momentum will absolutely continue. The second, I think the course is, and it actually has been set for a long time. The second, what can upset it? I mean, what can upset it is the same things that can upset things in America, social tensions. I mean, we saw that in in the Trump election. So there can be social tensions. If the country's progress is not inclusive, that could definitely have consequences.
So I think your question's fairly important in terms of like whether it is Modi who's driving it or what. I think India has come to a stage where it is not dependent on the Prime Minister per se. I think what we have seen post 1991, especially after the Vajpayee government, the momentum has actually stayed, or the direction has actually been there for a long time. It's about directionality. India has that direction in terms of like how they're really looking at aspirations and such things. Like what can topple it up? Like what Harshul was really talking about in terms of how do we really get the best out of the demographic dividend? That is going to be one of the most important factors that India will have to look at. But there is one more important thing that India needs to look at, and that is that how does we have to talk about those 3 T's: technology, tolerance, and talent. The biggest factor, countries which are tolerant to ideas or which are tolerant to diverse set of ideas will always prosper. Countries which do not, incidentally, I must share a statistic here, countries which have the highest quality of life, the Scandinavian countries, 97% of the people don't believe in God. A very interesting statistic for you to really make a judgment on it, because anyways, God is a mythical character that we have created. So how do we really go beyond that idea? And saying that, okay, now let's talk about humans and we just have one lifetime to really look at, because everything else, the next life, everything else is all bullshit. That's a different idea.
No, all I'll add is I think India is at an inflection point in some sense, and there are signs for all of us to see. India has the opportunity to leapfrog from being known as the destination from outsourcing to a destination for technology innovation. But for that to happen, I think one clear thing that I talked about was the labor transformation and how the government looks at the nuances and the contours of how skilling and the reskilling needs to happen in India. I think second is on innovation. While we have come up on the innovation rankings globally, it's a huge gap of where we need to be as compared to most of the Western world. But things are trending in the right trajectory. But specifically, if I look at as a practitioner, at Tech Mahindra, we hire close to about 700 to 800 people every week. Okay. And as we look at this hiring, we are realizing that there is massive saturation in markets like Bangalore or Hyderabad. India needs to tap into the tier 2. Our strategy is tier 2 and tier 3, which is where the next segment of growth is likely to emerge. Today, almost 50% of the new recruitments that we are doing today are happening in tier 2 cities. We strategically identified 10 tier 2 cities where we want to grow. Yeah? And if we don't consider Pune as a tier 2, if you consider Pune as a tier 2, which is a big hub for us, almost close to 20 to 23% of our headcount today, which is more than 100,000 people overall as a company in India, 120,000 probably today, comes from tier 2 cities. And that is where our next pivot is, where the attrition is lower, people are more hungrier, or more passionate, so on and so forth. So if India has to grow, its tier 2 cities have to grow.
So I think that's a really critical point. I mean, that gets at the issue of inclusivity, bringing all the states up to all boats rising on that tide. Because now there's 5 or 6 states that really tend to reap the benefits of the current economic.
Cities rather than just the states. I think we need to start looking at the cities because they are massive in size. And even tier 2 cities are bigger than the tier 1 cities here. So,
just adding to Harshul's point, if you really look at the cities itself, like Maharashtra contributes 17%, 18% of India's GDP, but just about 8 cities of Maharashtra contribute 90% of the GDP. So cities are critical, whether you talk about any state for that matter. It's the urban centers which are going to drive a lot of economic growth, and there are numbers to really share. So if you really look at the top 100 locations in India contribute 84% of India's GDP. So if you really look at it, like how that spread is actually happening, the 16% of GDP comes from close to about 669 districts. 100 districts contribute 84%. And 90% of exports happen from 100 districts, and 10% happens from the rest of the things. So like how do we really spread that is going to be one of the issues to look at.
And I think the good news is it's happening. If you go to Indore or Jaipur or even Chandigarh, yeah, I mean, it's actually happening today.
And you see that as an investor raising money? Is that where you see that?
I can tell you I've seen some very interesting opportunities from places like Indore. I mentioned Indore. All these places that I mentioned, I find lots of interesting activity going on. So it's spread out.
Let's go to the audience, please. Yeah, please. And if you give your name.
Yeah, hi, Asha, Jadeja, venture capitalist in the Bay Area. So, I mean, we all fully recognize that right now, while Modi is in power, that the relationship, the U.S. India corridor, the U.S. India relationship, the whole, momentum is robust. There's not going to be any slowdown as long as Modi is in power. However, what we have heard, and I'm sure you've heard it too from the opposition, especially from the Congress, and given our legacy in the legacy and history of socialism, I've seen statements from opposition Congress party saying we should be much more deeply aligned with China. Is this something that all of you see as? Is that something that's real? Are they just making noises for the optics? What are they doing? And why are these public statements coming out about that they feel that India should be aligned with China? And this includes Marsha. If you guys can give me your thoughts on this, do you think it's real? Is this something we should be worried about opposition?
I have not, frankly, Asha, I have not heard that. So, and maybe Rafiq might have some view on this, but I have not heard that.
I was going to say that perhaps that question is better directed at I might say that question might be better directed at Rafiq, but it's an interesting point.
Yeah, but I would just like to add, Asha, like opposition is doing what its job is. In fact, this government, when it was in opposition, they were always criticizing every damn thing under the sun, but the continuity of ideas was there. In fact, Rahul Gandhi recently, when he was in the US, he did say like he would have actually done the same thing on Ukraine, what the government of India has actually done. So if you really look at it, if you start looking at it deeper, I think there is a continuity of policy that India has had for the last 30 or 40 years. It will continue into that direction. I don't think directionally we are going to change. So that is where it is. So Indian policy today is independent of its leaders. If you please look at it, one thing, the Prime Minister it's not a president, he's a Prime Minister. So anybody could be the Prime Minister, but it's the Parliament which runs supreme, and that is how it drives the country.
I have a comment and an observation to make. I live in India. I work in policy, technology, and corporate, and with the government. Arun is smiling because he knows. I've never heard of this before from any party. I think today, if anyone in India is saying, hey, let's lean towards China, that would be news. It would be headline news. Whether it's the opposition or the current ruling party or any part of the opposition in any state, a lean towards China is probably the 180 degrees opposite of what people in India are really thinking.
In fact, I might make 2 points there. One is I totally agree with that. In fact, part of the issue is this. When companies are trying to diversify their supply chains, India could get more of it, but actually it's losing out to Vietnam because of this psychological feeling that we should be very, very careful in dealing with China. That's the first point. Second point, I totally agree with your point that on continuity, I can tell you when I was in the US government, I go to Delhi, one of our first visits, talk about the issues that US businesses are facing, like logistical issues, GST, and they all say, look, we are committed to GST. And they smile and say, you know what, we opposed it when we were in the opposition, but guess what, we're going to make it happen. And they did.
Exactly.
Well, thank you. I think it's a legitimate question given the Here we go. Thank you. So it's a legitimate question, given the where we are geopolitically today. I guess I would say, along the lines of Arun, this reconfiguration of supply chains has India in the spotlight, and India stands to really benefit from the reconfiguration of supply chains, which doesn't position it to be anti-China. It's an alternative to China, if you will, on that private sector basis. Let's move on. We have only a few minutes, I'm sorry to say, or the question right here.
I'll just show. I'm the provost at Golden Gate University, and I look at the title, U.S. India Technology Corridor, and I think it could be said U.S. India Human Capital Corridor. It is really the underpinning. And from your perspectives, what more could we do to encourage the free flow of human capital, both Indian students who want to study in the United States and encouraging U.S. students to go to India as well?
We'll take it right down the line again if each of you has a comment.
Well, I actually, Harshul might be the best person, but I totally agree that there should be more.
Oh yes, I think economic development is all about free movement of land, labor, capital, and data. So we have to find ways to really do that, possibly. And because exchange of ideas is what is important. Like US economy is always developed over a period of time because of the talent pool that you were able to create. And that's what needs to be continued to be done.
Yeah, and I see an expansion of collaboration between Indian universities and the US ones. Very recently, I heard about IIT Kanpur tying up with Rice University for the computer sciences. And we are seeing more and more happening. Particularly also smaller universities are setting up base in India, giving online courses, particularly with more online education becoming way of the norm of the day. It's becoming increasingly happening. But I think, to your broader point, I think if we open up the work permits post-education. Right now, people are restricted only if you have STEM degree, you get to stay in the US for I think about 3 years, 1+1+1. If you don't have a STEM degree, you can stay in the US for 1 year. And unless somebody sponsors your H1 visa, it's very hard. And getting visas is getting harder by the day. That's not what it used to be 20, 30 years ago. So I think there's some work needs to be done on that front.
So just to add to this point, there is a government of India policy now that international universities can come and open campuses, and that is going to be one big. In fact, I was just talking earlier to Zain that we should collect $1 billion and create one of the finest universities in India. Anybody wants to be part of it? Zain and I are already creating a consortium, so maybe we can always talk about it. So that's where it is.
Anita?
Collaborations have to increase. Two universities that I'm personally associated with since their founding. One is Ashoka University, and we have bilateral agreements with almost every university in the United States, every premier university in the United States, for exchange of students and exchange of faculty. The same is being done with Plaksha University, started with a bunch of IITians. And this is very focused on deep tech and AI and free flow of data and professors and academics. So I think the change is definitely in the offing. One comment I would like to make, and that is to Harshul's comment about innovation. At the end, the innovation capital of any country is really determined by the number of patents, the number of Nobel Prize winners, and we've had a long hiatus in India on both those fronts, and we are a little behind the curve there. So perhaps more conversation in the break.
Yes, because I'll differ with your opinion. And Nobel is a club of sorts, which is just allowing US academics to get in there. So let's not talk about it. Like, in fact, to be a Nobel laureate, the biggest proposition is that I have to have a divorce. So if I don't do it, I most likely, because all economic Nobel laureates have had a divorce once.
we'll take these two questions here, or maybe we'll take the three of you if you'd be very, very brief, and we'll close it with Anna. Please, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for your amazing and very interesting insight that you've given us. Just a quick question on the comments regarding the T2 cities and growth and promotion thereof. Is there work being done by the government to motivate multinational corporations to set up at these cities as opposed to the traditional, say, Bangalore and Hyderabad?
We might give that one to Amit, and then we'll ask this question here, please.
All the Asian tigers in China made their progress on manufacturing. A few years back, we did hear kind of manufactured in India slogan, and we do use the word technology sector. But could you give us an update of where really India stands on real manufacturing, and what's the prognosis for that? And if that doesn't grow significantly, will India be able to join the tigers in the future?
Okay.
Thank you.
Terrific. And then back here, please.
Hey, so quick question. I was stumped on a pitch last week, and hopefully three of you handsome brown men can do a better job of answering this question. There's a company that our friend is invested in went from 400 people to 14 in 1 year because of AI in the outsourcing world, right? Which happens probably is like 5 to 10% of that growth, right, for India.
Can you be very brief?
I will try my best. Thank you. How does, with the rollout of AI, what do you think really happens? How does that not slow growth? And do you think the Indian government creates rules around it?
All right, terrific. If Amit, you take the first, and maybe Harshul the second, and Arun if you'd the third.
I'll make the third one.
All right, go ahead.
I've already forgotten the first question. I think it was so. It was on the incentives for tier 2 cities. I'll just give you an example of the government of UP. As a case in point, UP has 700 odd urban locations, or tier 2, tier 3 cities, or what you call as urban local bodies. And they are really pushing hard for investments into these cities. Like Jhansi, for an example, which is an obscure city on the sides of UP, they are trying to create it as a defense hub. So there are things that the government is actually doing right now to push tier 2 cities over a period of time. Of course, it takes time, it takes years, but there is a definite push towards that kind of a momentum. So if you really look at it, typically we've been talking about 8 or 10 cities across the country, but today you can talk about close to about 140 to 150 urban locations which are driving economic growth or prosperity across the board. And you can actually count those. And if you want, I can share the list with you as well.
So Arun, you asked about manufacturing. So I believe that India is on a very steep upward path on manufacturing. If you look, for example, at the automobile production, it's really grown significantly. If you go to the automobile factories, they're very modern. In fact, I hardly see any people there. So that is a different question about employment. But on manufacturing itself, the sophistication of the things you see, the castings, the parts, is very, very high. 3D printing being used in a lot of sophisticated manufacturing. So there's a lot of manufacturing technologies being developed, robotics, control systems, and so forth within India. So India is definitely on the upward path in manufacturing.
Arun, do you want to mention briefly the PLI, the initiative?
Well, yeah, it's interesting that in terms of exports particularly, the production-linked incentive scheme of the Indian government has been very helpful. And they've also now got a design-linked incentive. So they essentially incents companies to design new electronic products or pharmaceutical molecules and so forth. So both of them are actually very interesting and successful interventions by the Indian government.
So Harshul, please take us home.
I think the last question was on AI and what it could do. It's very early days today to make a prediction one way or the other. I think everybody is deeply divided in where AI is going to take us, from people saying it's going to vanquish humanity to it's going to take us to the next level in terms of productivity. But just like it happens in every phase of change, when the Industrial Revolution happened, most people worried that people will lose their jobs. But since then, you see where we are. It's a question of how do we reskill ourselves? What kind of new category of jobs will emerge? I think the way I see it from our vantage point, being a technology consulting company, we are staying at the leading edge of generative AI, and we're trying to help our customers to think through what we call as experimentation as a service. We are helping them experiment with building use cases on generative AI in non-mission critical workloads and see how it is helping them or disrupting them. And early days, you can't really predict at this point.
Terrific. Thank you. Please join me in thanking them.
Yes, thank you all. That was a very optimistic outlook across the board on U.S. India relations. Rafiq is available all day if anyone wants to debate with him over the break, which we are going to have shortly. I want to thank our sponsors, Westbridge Capital, Samir Chadha, Maggie, and Rob Cox. They are all second-year sponsors, and we really appreciate them supporting us.